The morning Lena Whitmore fired Conrad Ash in front of 43 employees, she hadn't even asked him why he was late. She didn't ask because, in her estimation, it didn't matter. The Harwick plant had a policy. The policy had a threshold. Conrad had crossed it on the worst possible morning, and Lena Whitmore had built her reputation on the idea that rules meant nothing if they bent for the wrong person at the wrong time. So she walked out onto the floor at 8:14, found him at his station pulling off his jacket, and told him, in a voice that didn't rise or shake, that his access card would be deactivated by noon. Conrad didn't argue. He folded his jacket over the back of his chair, picked up the small photograph he kept taped to the edge of his toolbox. A girl, maybe 7 years old, gap-toothed and squinting into the sun, and he walked out the way he'd come in. Nobody said anything. Not because they didn't want to, but because some rooms understand, in a particular moment, that certain words would cost too much. Conrad Ash had worked at Harwick Mechanical for 11 years. He came in on the 3rd week of January, when the ground was still frozen, and the parking lot smelled like road salt, and he'd never left for another offer, even when 2 of them came in writing. He was the kind of mechanic who didn't need a second look at a problem. Engines spoke to him in a language that most people spent careers trying to learn and never quite did. He could hear a misfire the way a musician hears a wrong note, not intellectually, not after analysis, just immediately and without effort. His wife, Claire, had died 4 years before the morning Lena fired him. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless, the way that particular illness tends to be. She'd been 38. Their daughter, Phoebe, had been 3, and she'd understood enough to know something had gone permanently wrong, but not enough to name what it was. And Conrad had spent the years since trying to build something stable enough around that understanding that it wouldn't collapse when she was finally old enough to ask. He drove a '98 Silverado with a heater that worked intermittently and a back seat where Phoebe had left approximately 11 crayons and 1 orange slice that had been there since November. He lived in a 2-bedroom house in Kettleford, 20 minutes east of the plant, on a street where the houses were small and close together, and the neighbors looked out for each other in the specific, unspoken way that people do when they don't have much margin for error. His neighbor, Helen, watched Phoebe on mornings when Conrad had an early shift. She was 67 and retired, and she made Phoebe toast with too much butter and let her watch cartoons until 8:30. And Conrad had learned not to take this arrangement for granted because he knew exactly how rare it was. The morning everything collapsed, Helen had called at 5:45 to say she'd fallen on the ice getting her mail the night before, and her wrist was wrapped and she was sorry. She was so sorry, she knew it was short notice. Conrad had said it was fine. He'd said it 3 times, actually, because he meant it, and because he didn't want her to spend the morning feeling responsible for what came next. He'd spent an hour calling everyone he had a number for. His sister in Sudbury was already at work. Phoebe's school didn't have before care on Fridays. The one other father in his small orbit of people, a man named Greg from Phoebe's swimming class, didn't pick up. By 6:50, Conrad had made a decision that any parent who has ever stood in that particular hallway understands without needing it explained. He stayed with Phoebe until the school bus came at 7:42, which meant he was walking through the plant doors at 8:14 instead of 7:30, and the 44 minutes in between had cost him everything. He hadn't called ahead because he'd been on the phone continuously trying to solve the problem. He hadn't texted because his hands had been busy. He would have explained all of this if Lena had asked. She hadn't asked. What Lena Whitmore didn't know, what almost nobody at Harwick Mechanical knew, was what Conrad had been doing the night before she fired him. The call had come in at 9:45 on Thursday evening from a direct number Conrad recognized as belonging to Harwick's fleet manager, a quiet, meticulous man named Stuart Orr. The plant kept 3 vehicles for executive transport, and one of them, a 2019 Land Rover Defender that Lena used for the quarterly site visits up to the Sudbury location. had started making a sound that Stewart described, with some embarrassment, as a sort of grinding complaint from the front left, which I know is not technical, but I'm not sure how else to put it. Conrad had been reading to Phoebe. He'd gotten to the part where the rabbit finds the hidden door, and Phoebe was already half asleep, and he'd thought for a moment about letting the call go to voicemail. He didn't, because he never did. Stewart explained that the vehicle was due to take Lena to Sudbury at 6 the next morning for the Harwick Northern Division review, a meeting that had been on the books for 3 months and involved people who had flown in from Calgary and Halifax and were not the kind of people you rescheduled. The regular shop was closed. The overnight contract service had a 4-hour minimum and a waiting list until 2 a.m. Stewart had run out of options before he'd thought to call Conrad, and he said so with the directness of a man who knows when he's asking a favor. Conrad said he'd come in and take a look. He kissed Phoebe's forehead, turned off her lamp, and drove back to the plant. The grinding was a worn CV joint on the front axle, and it had worn because something in the boot had cracked and let the grease out, and it had done this because of a manufacturer's recall notice that had been sitting in the vehicle file since March and that nobody had acted on. Conrad found this out at 11:15, sitting on a creeper under the front end of Lena's truck, a flashlight in one hand and a creeping sense of familiar frustration in the other. He didn't say anything about the recall notice. He ordered the part from the emergency supplier account, waited 40 minutes for the delivery driver, and put the joint in himself. He bled the brake line that had developed a soft spot. He checked the tire pressure and the wiper fluid and the spare. He drove the truck around the empty parking lot at 1:20 in the morning to confirm it ran clean, which it did. He entered the work order in the fleet system under his own employee number, noted the recall issue and the repair, and listed the time as complete at 1:34 a.m. He drove home. He slept for 3.5 hours. He got up when Phoebe got up, made her oatmeal, called Helen, spent an hour trying to solve an unsolvable problem, waited for the school bus, and arrived at work 44 minutes late. Stewart Orr had not yet come in when Conrad was fired. He arrived at 8:40 to find Conrad's station empty and to hear from the woman who worked the parts desk what had happened. Stewart stood at the parts desk for a moment without saying anything. Then he went directly to Lena's office. Lena Whitmore had been plant manager at Harwick for 6 years. She'd come up through operations, not engineering, and she made no apology for that. She'd inherited a floor that ran 40 minutes slow on average and a budget that had been padded in the wrong places for a decade, and she'd fixed both of those things in 18 months, which was the kind of result that made people forgive a great deal in a manager. Her employees respected her competence. Some of them liked her. Most of them were careful around her, in the specific way people are careful around someone who has never once, within their memory, been wrong about anything in a way that cost her personally. She was on a call with the Calgary office when Stewart knocked. She held up one finger. Stewart did not sit down. He stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has decided, on his walk across the floor, exactly what he is going to say and exactly how he is going to say it. When the call ended, Lena set her phone face down on the desk. Stewart said, "I need to tell you something about Conrad Ash." Lena said, "We've processed his termination, if there are. He came in at 9:45 last night." Stewart said, "And he worked until 1:30 in the morning on your vehicle, the Defender, the one you drove to Sudbury at 6 this morning." Lena was quiet. "There was a recall on the front axle," Stewart continued. "It had been in the file since March. Nobody caught it. The joint was worn through. If he hadn't replaced it, you would have had a brake and steering issue somewhere around Parry Sound, in the dark, in freezing rain." He placed a printed copy of the work order on her desk. Conrad's employee number was at the top. The timestamp read 1:34 a.m. "He didn't call in sick this morning," Stewart said. "He was 44 minutes late. He fixed your vehicle until 1:30 in the morning. Then he went home, and something happened with his daughter's care arrangement, and he was 44 minutes late." Stewart had worked at Harwick for 19 years. He had never once raised his voice to a manager. He didn't raise it now. "I'm not telling you what to do," he said, "but I think you should know what you did." He left the work order on her desk and walked back out to the floor. What happened next did not happen quickly, which is the part of the story that people sometimes want to skip over because quick justice is more satisfying than slow justice, and slow justice requires sitting with discomfort for longer than most people want to. Lena did not call Conrad that morning. She sat with the work order for 2 hours. She pulled the digital fleet log, which confirmed Stewart's account. She pulled the recall file, which confirmed the March entry, and the lack of any follow-up action, and the fact that the vehicle had passed 3 internal reviews since then without anyone noting the open recall. She called Stewart back at 11. "Who was responsible for the recall follow-up?" she asked. Stewart said, "Technically, the fleet management protocol assigns it to the supervisor on duty at the time the notice arrives. That was Marcus Hale." He paused. "Marcus Hale, who processed the termination paperwork this morning." Lena said nothing. "Conrad submitted the work order correctly," Stewart said. "Under his own number, it's in the system. There's no ambiguity about what he did or when he did it." Lena thanked him and ended the call. She sat for a long time looking at the photograph of Sudbury she kept on her wall. The northern plant, winter, the kind of sky that is more gray than blue. And she thought about the road between here and there, and the stretch near Parry Sound where the highway curves, and whether she would have known before the front end went what was about to happen. She thought about a 7-year-old girl eating toast at her neighbor's house, whose father was now unemployed, and who would find out why only after Phoebe was old enough to understand what a CV joint was, and why the timing of things sometimes works against people who have done nothing wrong. She called HR at 1:15 and asked to have Conrad's file placed on hold. Conrad found out about the hold the same way he found out about most things that happened at the plant after he left. From Stewart, who called his cell at 3 in the afternoon and said, "I don't know what's going to happen, but I wanted you to know what I told her." Conrad was in his driveway. Phoebe had gotten off the bus an hour earlier and was inside watching something with horses in it, and Conrad had come outside to get some air and found he didn't want to go back in yet. He said, "I appreciate that, Stewart." Stewart said, "You should have called when Helen canceled." Conrad said, "I know. You have a union card. You had options." "I know," Conrad said. "I was trying to solve the problem myself." There was a pause. Stewart said, "That's what you always do." Conrad didn't say anything. "That's not a criticism," Stewart said. I'm noting it." After the call, Conrad sat on the front step for a while. The street was quiet. 2 doors down, his neighbor's kid was pushing a bicycle with a flat tire, not going anywhere, just pushing it in a slow circle in the driveway as though the problem would resolve itself if he stayed close to it long enough. Conrad watched him for a while. He recognized the logic. The review took 11 days. HR interviewed Stewart, reviewed the fleet records, cross-referenced the recall file, and noted that the open recall had not been flagged to Lena's attention at any point in 7 months, and that the person who'd had oversight responsibility for fleet documentation during that period was the same person who had, without flagging the lapse or the context of the overnight repair, initiated termination proceedings against the employee who had actually fixed the problem. Marcus Hale submitted a written response that said the fleet documentation had been deprioritized due to operational demands, and that the delay in recall action was a systemic issue, not an individual oversight. The written response was 4 pages long and contained the word systemic 7 times. Lena read it on a Tuesday morning and then read the work order again, which was 1 page and contained Conrad's name twice and his employee number once, and no other words that weren't strictly necessary. She called a meeting. The meeting involved Stewart, HR, and the operations director, a deliberate woman named Frances Gould, who had the quality of someone who has seen most things and remained undisturbed by the majority of them. Frances had read the file before walking in. She asked 2 questions and made 2 observations. And her second observation was that the termination had been executed without the investigative step required by the collective agreement for employees with more than 5 years of service. He has 11, Lena said. I know, Frances said. The termination was reversed on a Thursday. Lena called Conrad herself, which she could have had HR do but chose not to. She told him the review had concluded, that the termination had been overturned, and that she wanted him to come back to work Monday. Conrad said, I appreciate that. There was a pause. Lena said, I want to ask you something, and you can answer however you want. Conrad waited. Why didn't you say something when I walked out there? Why didn't you tell me where you'd been the night before, or why you were late, or anything? Conrad thought about it for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give her the real one. He said, You'd already decided, I could see it. And I've learned that when someone has already decided, what you say doesn't become evidence. It becomes an excuse. Lena was quiet for long enough that Conrad thought the call might have dropped. She said, That's a fair observation. He said, I'm not saying it to make you feel bad. She said, I know, that's partly why it does. He came back on Monday. The floor was quiet when he walked in, not the uncomfortable quiet of 11 days before, but a different kind. The kind that happens when people are paying attention without wanting to appear to be. He hung his jacket on the hook behind his station, opened his toolbox, and found that someone had left a coffee on top of it. No note. Medium double-double, which was the only thing he ever ordered and which everyone on the floor knew. He picked it up and took a sip and got to work. Marcus Hale was not there that Monday. He was not there the following Monday either. The reason was never formally announced, which was the standard way these things were handled, and most people understood it without being told. The fleet recall log was updated. A new documentation protocol was introduced. Nobody called it what it was, which was a correction, which was the thing they probably should have done in March. 3 weeks after Conrad came back, on a Wednesday afternoon in early February, Lena came down to the floor. This was not unusual in itself. She walked the floor twice a week, a habit she'd maintained since her first year, but she came directly to Conrad's station, which was unusual, and she stood there for a moment before she said anything. Conrad was doing a valve adjustment on a Kenworth that had come in from a logging contractor up near Chaplow. He'd found 2 additional issues in the process that hadn't been on the work order, and he was deciding how to prioritize them. Lena said, The Defender is back for its scheduled maintenance. Conrad said, I saw it on the board. I wanted you to do it. Conrad looked up. Stewart's got Kelleher on it. I know, she said. I'm asking if you'd take it over. Conrad considered this for a moment. There was a version of what she was asking that was a peace offering. There was another version that was an acknowledgement of something that couldn't be said more directly. In the middle of a work floor on a Wednesday afternoon, he said, Sure. He did the Defender on Thursday morning. It was straightforward. Oil change, filter, tire rotation, the kind of maintenance that a vehicle needs when it's been driven hard in winter conditions. He found nothing wrong. He checked the recall registry before signing off, out of habit, and found it clear. He printed the completed work order, filed it in the system, and clipped a copy to the keys before leaving them at the front desk. He didn't tell anyone he'd checked the registry. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed to be said. Phoebe asked him about it in March, on a Saturday morning when he was making pancakes and she was doing a puzzle at the kitchen table that had been half done for 6 weeks because she kept losing the edge pieces under the radiator. She asked, Dad, what happened at work? You were home for a long time and then you went back. Conrad said, I made a mistake, and someone made a mistake, and then it got sorted out. Phoebe was quiet for a moment. She was 7, and she was in the phase of processing things by holding them at arm's length and examining them from different angles before deciding how to hold them. She said, What kind of mistake? Conrad said, I didn't tell anyone something I should have told them, and someone else didn't ask something they should have asked. She thought about this. That's two mistakes. It is, Conrad said. So it was both your faults. He set a plate in front of her, more or less. She picked up her fork and returned her attention to the puzzle. After a minute, she said, without looking up, Helen says mistakes are how you find out what you actually think about things. Conrad looked at her. When did Helen say that? When I fell off my bike and blamed the sidewalk. She moved a puzzle piece experimentally. She said I was blaming the sidewalk so I didn't have to think about what I'd actually done. Conrad poured himself a coffee. She's not wrong, he said. Phoebe said, I know, she's usually not. She found an edge piece and clicked it into place with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been patient long enough. I'm glad you're back at work, he said. Me too, Bug, she said. You were kind of sad when you were home, he said. I was, even though you were home more. Even though, he said. Funny how that works. She nodded seriously, as though she had filed this observation away for future reference, and returned to her puzzle, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the snow had started to ease off into the kind of thin, tentative light that February sometimes offers as an apology for everything that came before it. Conrad stood at the counter with his coffee and thought about what you owe someone when you've been wrong about them and whether there was a version of that debt you could fully repay, and decided that what you probably owed them was not a dramatic gesture or a formal acknowledgement, but the slower, quieter work of paying attention the next time, of asking the question before you reached the conclusion, of leaving enough space between what you think you know and what might actually be true. He didn't think Lena had learned that yet, fully, but he thought she was trying, and there was something about that, about watching someone try, seriously and without theater, to do better, that made it possible to return to a place and find it not quite the same as when you left. He finished his coffee. He rinsed the mug. Come on, he said. Get your boots. We promised Helen we'd clear her walk. Phoebe slid off her chair without complaint, which meant she'd already decided she wanted to go, and pulled her boots out from under the bench by the door with the focused energy of someone who has somewhere to be. She said, Do we get hot chocolate after? He said. If you shovel more than half, she said. I always shovel more than half. You always think you shovel more than half. She considered this with mock seriousness, and then she grinned, and it was her mother's grin, the one that arrived without warning and stayed for longer than you expected, and that Conrad had learned to take as a gift every time it appeared, without trying to hold it or examine it too closely. He held the door open. They went out into the light.